The Carnival's final secret. You won't believe the final twist. Chapter 1. The Arrival. The town of Hollow's End lay cradled between two steep hills, like a forgotten relic from a time when life moved more slowly. It was a place where nothing much ever happened, where the days bled together in a quiet rhythm, marked only by the tolling of the church bell on Sundays and the occasional passing of a truck along the single road that wound its way through the valley. The people who lived there were content in their simplicity, their lives governed by routine and the changing season. They had no need for the outside world, and the outside world had long since forgotten them. The morning began as it always did, with the first rays of sunlight creeping over the hills, bathing the town in a soft, golden light. Martha Foster, a woman whose hair had long since turned the color of the morning mist, woke to the familiar creak of her bed. She sat up slowly, her joints stiff from the cold that seemed to settle in the valley like a shroud. Martha had been alone for nearly a decade now, her husband having passed away one bitter winter night, leaving her with a house too large and too empty. She filled her days with small tasks, tending to her garden, knitting by the fire, and occasionally visiting the graveyard where her husband rested. It was a quiet life, but it was all she knew. On this particular morning, however, something felt different. As she pulled back the curtains, Martha's breath caught in her throat. There, in the town square, stood a sight so unexpected, so out of place, that for a moment she thought she might still be dreaming. A carnival, if one could even call it that, had appeared overnight, its tents and booths arranged in a haphazard manner as if dropped from the sky. Structures were old, the paint peeling, the fabric worn and tattered. Yet, despite its dilapidated appearance, Carnival seemed to hum with a strange energy. An invitation whispered on the breeze. Martha dressed quickly. Her curiosity piqued despite the unease that gnawed at her inside. She wasn't the only one drawn to the square that morning. As she made her way down the narrow lane that led from her house to the center of town, she saw others emerging from their homes, their faces a mix of wonder and wariness. It was as if the entire town had been stirred from a long slumber, their dreams manifesting in the form of this mysterious carnival. Tommy Granger was the first to reach the square. At 12 years old, he was all wild energy and restless curiosity, the kind of boy who never walked when he could run, and never asked for permission when he could simply act. He had seen the carnival as soon as he stepped outside, and without a second thought, he had sprinted toward it, his heart pounding with excitement. This was something new, something different. A break from the monotony of school and chores, of long, dull afternoons spent finding ways to entertain himself in a town that had little to offer a boy like him. Tommy stopped at the edge of the square, his eyes wide as he took in the sight before him. The carnival was both alluring and unsettling, its colors faded but still vibrant enough to catch the eye. He could see the outlines of rides, though they looked more like the ghosts of amusement than the real thing, their frames creaking in the wind. There was a carousel, its horses frozen in mid-gallop, their painted eyes dull and lifeless. There were booths, their striped awnings fluttering like tattered flags, and beyond them, the looming shadow of a Ferris wheel. Carriages swaying gently as if moved by invisible hands. As the other townspeople began to gather, Tommy could feel the tension in the air, a mix of excitement and apprehension. He wasn't the only one drawn in by the carnival's strange appeal. The entire town seemed to be under its spell. Evelyn Carter, the town's schoolteacher, arrived shortly after, her expression one of cautious skepticism. Evelyn had lived in Hollow's End her entire life, and she knew every nook and cranny of the town like the back of her hand. The appearance of a carnival, especially one that had materialized overnight, was not something she could easily accept. She approached the square with measured steps, her eyes narrowing as she took in the scene. There was something off about the whole thing, something that made her skin prickle with unease. But even as her mind whispered warnings, she found herself drawn forward, unable to resist the pull of the unknown. The last to arrive was George Holloway, the town's sheriff, a man of few words and many suspicions. George had seen his fair share of odd occurrences in his years as a lawman, but this was something else entirely. He stood at the edge of the square, his hand resting on the hilt of his revolver, his eyes scanning the carnival with the keen gaze of a hunter assessing a potential threat. Carnival, for all its apparent harmlessness, did not sit right with him. It was as if the very air around it was charged with something dark and dangerous, something that set his instincts on edge. Yet, despite his misgivings, George felt the same inexplicable pull that had ensnared the others. Carnival seemed to beckon to him, whispering promises of mystery and intrigue, of secrets waiting to be uncovered. He knew he should be cautious, that he should perhaps warn the townspeople to stay away until he could investigate further. The words stuck in his throat. Instead, he found himself stepping forward, joining the others as they gathered at the entrance to the carnival. The entrance was marked by a faded archway, its once bright colors now muted and worn. A banner stretched across the top, its letters barely legible. "Welcome to the Carnival of Wonders." The words seemed almost mocking, as if daring the townspeople to believe in the wonders it claimed to offer. Beyond the archway, Carnival sprawled out in a labyrinth of tents and booths, paths winding and twisting like the coils of a snake. For a moment, the townspeople hesitated, standing on the threshold of the unknown. The square was silent, save for the faint creak of the Ferris wheel and the distant rustle of the wind. The carnival waited, patient and unyielding, its secrets hidden in the shadows of its aging structures. Martha was the first to break the silence. "It wasn't here yesterday," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Where did it come from?" No one answered her question, for no one had an answer. Carnival had simply appeared, as if by magic, defying all logic and reason. But logic and reason had no place here, not in the face of the carnival's strange allure. Tommy, ever the bold one, took a step forward. "Let's go in," he said, his voice filled with the reckless enthusiasm of youth. "What are we waiting for?" Evelyn and George exchanged a glance, both of them feeling the weight of the decision before them. They were the town's guardians, the ones who were supposed to protect its people from harm. But how could they protect anyone from something they didn't understand? And yet, despite their reservations, they too felt the pull of the carnival, a magnetic force that drew them closer with each passing second. It was as if the carnival itself was alive, breathing and pulsating with a life of its own, heart beating in time with their own. Finally, it was George who made the decision. "We'll go in," he said, voice firm. "But we stay together. No one goes off on their own." The others nodded, and together they stepped through the archway, crossing the threshold into the carnival's twisted domain. As they did, the air seemed to shift, growing heavier, more oppressive. The light dimmed, as if the sun itself was afraid to shine too brightly on this place. The carnival's paths wound through the square like veins, leading them deeper into its heart. The sounds of the town faded behind them, replaced by the creak of old wood and the distant, eerie music that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Martha felt her heart pounding in her chest, a mix of fear and excitement. She hadn't felt anything like this in years, not since her husband had passed. It was a strange, intoxicating sensation, one that made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in a long time. Tommy was practically vibrating with excitement, his eyes darting from one attraction to the next. He could hardly wait to explore, to see what wonders the carnival had in store. Evelyn kept a tight grip on her handbag, her knuckles white. She didn't like this, didn't like it at all. But she was here now, and there was no turning back. George walked at the front of the group, his hand never straying far from his revolver. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something unseen was lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. As they ventured deeper into the carnival, the atmosphere grew thicker, more oppressive. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, things long past their prime. Colors of the tents and booths were muted, as if drained of life, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist in unnatural ways. The carnival was old, far older than it had any right to be. It was a relic from another time, a time when the world was darker, more dangerous. And yet, despite its age, it had a strange vitality to it, a pulse that thrummed beneath the surface, just out of reach. They passed by the carousel, its horses frozen in mid-gallop, their painted eyes dull and lifeless. Tommy paused to touch one of them, and for a moment he thought he felt the horse shiver beneath his fingers. Quickly pulled his hand away, chill running down his spine. Martha and Evelyn exchanged uneasy glances, both of them feeling the weight of the place pressing down on them. It was as if the carnival was alive, aware of their presence, and it didn't like it. George led them on, his gaze sharp, his senses on high alert. He knew something was wrong here, something beyond the ordinary. But what it was, didn't say. All he knew was that they were in danger, though from what, he had yet to determine. They came to a stop in front of a large, tattered tent, its entrance flanked by two statues of grotesque figures, their faces twisted in expressions of agony and despair. The tent's fabric was dark and heavy, and from within, they could hear the faint sound of music, a haunting melody that sent shivers down their spines. Tommy was the first to speak. "What do you think's inside?" he asked, his voice hushed. George didn't answer immediately. Could feel the weight of the decision before him, the knowledge that whatever lay beyond that entrance could change everything. But the carnival had drawn them in, and now there was no turning back. Finally, he spoke. "We're about to find out." With that, he stepped forward, pushing aside the heavy fabric and stepping into the darkness beyond. The others hesitated for a moment, but then, one by one, they followed, crossing the threshold into the unknown. As they entered the tent, the air grew colder, the darkness thicker. The music grew louder, more insistent, filling their ears with its haunting melody. The walls of the tent seemed to close in around them, the space growing smaller, more confined. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the music stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, a thick, oppressive blanket that seemed to smother them. They were not alone in the tent. Chapter 2. Entering the Carnival. The fog descended on them like a shroud as they crossed the threshold, thick and damp, muffling their footsteps and swallowing their voices. It was a fog that clung to their clothes, seeped into their skin, and turned the world into a dreamscape where nothing was certain and everything was obscured. Air was sweet with the cloying scent of spun sugar, but beneath it lingered something darker, something rotten that twisted in their noses and settled uneasily in their stomachs. Martha was the first to feel it. Pull, gentle but insistent, like an unseen hand guiding her toward a small, dimly lit tent nestled at the carnival's edge. The fabric of the tent was faded and frayed, yet the sign above it, Madame Zara, fortune teller, gleamed with an unnatural brilliance as if freshly painted. Martha hesitated for only a moment, her heart heavy with memories of lost days and lonely nights. Promise of answers, of solace, drew her forward, and before she knew it, she was stepping inside, the fog curling behind her as the entrance flapped shut. Inside, the air was thick with incense, the smoky tendrils curling in the dim light of a single flickering candle. The fortune teller, a woman cloaked in shadow and mystery, sat behind a small table draped in rich velvet. Her eyes, dark and knowing, seemed to pierce through Martha, and for a moment, the old woman felt as though she were laid bare before this stranger, every secret, every sorrow exposed. "Come closer, dear." Fortune teller's voice was a whisper, yet it echoed in Martha's mind as if shouted. "I see much that troubles you. Sit, and let me tell you what the cards reveal." Martha hesitated, her pulse quickening. There was something unsettling about the woman, something that made her want to turn and flee back into the fog. But the need for answers, for some kind of comfort, was too strong. Slowly, she lowered herself onto the rickety chair, her hands trembling as they rested on the table. Meanwhile, outside, Tommy Granger was drawn to a different kind of thrill. The haunted house loomed before him. The decaying structure with crumbling walls and windows seemed to stare back at him like dead, empty eyes. The sign above the door, "The House of Horrors," was barely legible, the paint peeling and faded, but it called to him nonetheless. He grinned, his heart racing with the excitement of the unknown, of the chance to prove his bravery. Without a second thought, he pushed the creaking door open and stepped inside. The door slammed shut behind him with a force that made him jump, and the darkness swallowed him whole. For a moment, all was silent, save for the sound of his own breathing, loud and ragged in the oppressive gloom. Then, from somewhere deep within the house, a sound began. a low, mournful wail that echoed through the halls, sending shivers down his spine. Tommy squared his shoulders, refusing to be frightened, and took a step forward, the floorboards creaking ominously beneath his feet. As Tommy ventured deeper into the haunted house, Evelyn Carter found herself drawn to a different kind of mystery. The Hall of Mirrors stood before her, a twisted labyrinth of glass and reflections, each one slightly distorted, each one showing something not quite right. The sign, the Hall of Reflections, glinted in the dim light, and Evelyn felt a strange compulsion to enter, see what lay within those mirrored walls. She stepped through the entrance, and the world seemed to shift around her, the air growing colder, the light dimmer. The mirrors reflected her image back at her, but as she walked, she began to notice the oddities. Her reflection lingered a moment too long after she had passed, or seemed to move when she stood still. At first, she dismissed it as a trick of the light, clever illusion meant to unsettle. But as she ventured deeper, the reflections grew more sinister. They smiled when she did not, their eyes glinting with malice, their movements jerky and unnatural. Cold dread began to settle in the pit of her stomach. Still, she pressed on, drawn forward by a curiosity she could not explain. George Holloway, ever the skeptic, found himself following a different path. The faint strains of a ghostly tune reached his ears, the notes curling through the fog like tendrils of smoke. The sound was oddly familiar, yet distant, like a lullaby half remembered from a dream. He followed the music, his footsteps slow and deliberate, until he found himself standing before a carousel. The carousel was ancient, its paint peeling, horses chipped and worn, yet it turned slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if powered by some unseen force. The music that played was eerie, a distorted waltz that sent shivers down his spine. The horses, once proud and majestic, now seemed to leer at him with hollow eyes, their mouths twisted into ghastly grins. Despite his better judgment, George stepped closer, the music drawing him in, its hypnotic rhythm wrapping around him like a spell. As each of them delved deeper into their chosen attractions, the carnival began to reveal its true nature. In the fortune-teller's tent, Martha listened in growing horror as Madame Zara spoke of things only she could know, secrets Martha had never shared with anyone, fears she had never voiced. The cards on the table revealed images that struck too close to home. A house consumed by flames, a man lying lifeless on the ground, a woman weeping over a grave. The fortune-teller's voice grew louder, more insistent, as if the words were being forced from her, and Martha felt a cold dread settle over her, the air around her growing thicker, choking. In the haunted house, Tommy's bravado began to falter as the wails grew louder, more desperate, the sound echoing through the empty halls. Shadows moved in the corners of his vision, too quick to catch, but always there, always watching. The walls seemed to close in on him, the air growing colder with each step. He tried to tell himself it was all part of the attraction, just an illusion meant to scare him. But the fear was real, primal terror that gripped his heart and sent icy fingers down his spine. Evelyn, lost in the maze of mirrors, began to feel a growing sense of panic. The reflections no longer mirrored her movements. They had taken on a life of their own, mocking her, mimicking her fears, their faces twisting into grotesque parodies of her own. She turned to leave, but the mirrors had closed in around her, trapping her in a prison of glass and reflection. Every direction she turned, she was met with her own image, distorted and twisted, her own eyes staring back at her with a terror she could not escape. George, standing before the carousel, felt the music wrap around him, pulling him in, the world fading away as the tune grew louder, more insistent. He watched as the carousel began to spin faster, the horses blurring together, their ghastly grins widening as the music crescendoed. The ground seemed to tilt beneath him, and he reached out to steady himself, but there was nothing to hold on to. The world spun around him, faster and faster, until all that remained was the music, the haunting, hypnotic tune that drilled into his mind, driving out all thought, all reason. The carnival had them now, ensnared in its web of illusions and deceit, each of them lost in their own private nightmare. The fog thickened around the carnival, a barrier that separated them from the outside world, trapping them in this twisted realm where nothing was as it seemed. The sweet scent of candy had turned sour, air thick with the stench of decay and death. The lights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to dance and writhe in the mist. Martha tried to pull away from the fortune teller, but her feet felt rooted to the ground, her body frozen in place. The cards on the table had begun to move, shifting and changing, the images blurring together into a kaleidoscope of horror. Madame Zara's voice had changed, becoming something darker, more malevolent, as if another presence had taken hold of her. The words that spilled from her lips were not meant for mortal ears, and they cut through Martha like knives, leaving her gasping for breath, her mind teetering on the edge of madness. Tommy stumbled through the haunted house, his earlier bravado completely gone. The shadows had come alive, reaching out to him with grasping, clawed hands, their whispers filling his ears with promises of pain and suffering. He ran, his heart pounding in his chest, but no matter how fast he moved, he could not escape. The walls seemed to shift and change, leading him deeper into the house, deeper into the darkness, until there was nothing left but the sound of his own ragged breathing and the cold, unrelenting grip of terror. Evelyn pounded on the mirrors, desperate to break free, but the glass would not shatter, would not give way. The reflections had become her captors, their twisted faces pressed against the glass, their eyes filled with malice and hunger. They mimicked her every movement, every expression, but their actions were exaggerated, grotesque, turning her own fear against her. She could see herself growing smaller, more insignificant, as the mirrors closed in around her, the walls of her prison tightening with each passing moment. George had fallen to his knees before the carousel, music pounding in his ears, driving him to the brink of insanity. The horses had come alive, their bodies writhing and twisting, their mouths open in silent screams. The world spun around him, faster and faster, until he could no longer tell up from down, reality from illusion. The music had become a cacophony, discordant symphony that tore through his mind, leaving nothing but confusion and despair in its wake. The carnival had them all, each of them trapped in their own personal nightmare, unable to escape, unable to wake from the dream that had become their reality. Fog thickened, the lights dimmed, and the air grew colder, as the carnival's true nature was revealed. This was no place of fun and games, no innocent fairground meant to entertain. This was a place of darkness, of despair, where the lines between reality and illusion blurred, and the only escape was madness. And as the night wore on, as the fog continued to swirl around the carnival, the true horror of their situation began to sink in. There was no way out, no escape from the nightmares that had ensnared them. Carnival had claimed them, body and soul, and it would not let them go. Chapter 3: The Traps Close In. The carnival had shed its whimsical facade, revealing the grotesque reality beneath, and now it tightened its grip on its captives, each of them isolated in their own harrowing nightmare. The fog that clung to the air thickened, turning the very atmosphere into something suffocating, as though the carnival itself had become a living thing, breathing in their terror, feeding on their despair. Martha's hands shook as she tried to tear her eyes away from the fortune teller's cards, but they held her in place, as if they had become extensions of her own mind, twisting and manipulating her memories. Madame Zara's voice, once a mere whisper in the darkness, now echoed in her skull, dredging up moments from her past that Martha had buried deep within. Each word, each recollection, was like a dagger, slicing through the thin veneer of control she had maintained for so long. The scenes that played out on the cards were more vivid than her own memories, more real than the present. She saw her daughter Emily as a child, laughing and playing in the sun, her face glowing with the innocence of youth. But the image warped, shifting to Emily's funeral, the casket closing over her daughter's lifeless form. Martha tried to close her eyes, but even behind her eyelids, the visions persisted, cruel and relentless. The fortune teller's words were a constant drone, pulling her deeper into the past, into a spiral of grief that had no end. "You should have saved her," Madame Zara murmured, her voice both soothing and accusatory. "You should have been there. She needed you, but you were too lost in your own world, weren't you?" Martha wanted to scream, to deny the words, the truth of them lodged in her throat, choking her. She had always blamed herself, had always carried the weight of that guilt. But here in this place, that guilt had taken on a life of its own. a monstrous thing that clawed at her sanity, dragging her back into a loop of endless regret. Meanwhile, Tommy found himself wandering through corridors that seemed to stretch into infinity, the walls of the haunted house shifting and twisting around him. The very structure of the place was fluid, unstable, and he could no longer tell where he had been or where he was going. The air grew colder with each step, temperature dropping to a bone-chilling degree. His breath came in ragged gasps, visible in the frigid air as the darkness around him deepened, pressing in on all sides. He could feel the malevolent presence of the house, a living entity that watched him with unseen eyes, waiting for him to falter. The shadows that flickered at the edge of his vision were no longer mere tricks of the light. They had substance, form, and intent. They whispered to him in voices that were both his own and that of strangers, filling his mind with doubts, with fears he had long tried to bury. "You're not brave," they taunted. "You're nothing, a coward, just like before." Tommy shook his head, trying to clear the voices from his mind, but they persisted, growing louder with each step. The house seemed to shift around him, the walls closing in, then expanding, creating a labyrinth of endless corridors and doors that led nowhere. He began to run, desperate to escape the voices, the shadows, the cold that gnawed at his bones. But no matter how fast he moved, the house was always one step ahead, trapping him in a nightmarish realm where reality and illusion had merged into one. Evelyn's world had become a maze of glass, a labyrinth of reflections that twisted and distorted her every move. The mirrors no longer merely reflected her image, they had taken on a life of their own, mocking her with cruel, twisted versions of herself. Each doppelganger she encountered was more malevolent than the last, their faces contorted into expressions of hatred and malice. They leered at her, their eyes burning with a dark fire that made her skin crawl. "You're nothing but a shadow," one of them hissed, its voice a harsh whisper that echoed through the hall. "A pale imitation of what you could have been." Another reflection stepped forward, its smile wide and predatory. "You think you're different, special? You're just like the rest of them, lost, weak, afraid." Evelyn tried to retreat, but the mirrors had surrounded her, trapping her in a cage of glass and reflection. Every turn brought her face to face with another twisted version of herself, each one more terrifying than the last. Their voices overlapped, cacophony of accusations and taunts that drowned out her thoughts, filling her with a sense of hopelessness that threatened to consume her. "Give in," they whispered. "Let go. It's easier that way." But Evelyn refused to give in, even as the panic clawed at her throat, and even as the reflections grew bolder, their hands pressing against the glass, as if they were trying to break free, to pull her in with them. She knew, deep down, that if she let them, they would consume her, replace her, and she would be lost forever in this maze of mirrors, just another twisted reflection. George, meanwhile, had fallen under the spell of the carousel. The music that had once been a soft, eerie melody had become something else entirely, a siren song that wrapped around his mind, pulling him deeper into its thrall. The carousel spun faster now, the horses blurring into streaks of color as they raced around and around, their hollow eyes fixed on him, their mouths twisted into ghastly grins. He could feel the pull of the carousel, force that seemed to draw the very life from his body, draining him with each rotation. His limbs grew heavy, his breath labored, as though the weight of years had suddenly settled on his shoulders. He tried to step back, pull away from the carousel's grasp, but his feet felt rooted to the ground, unable to move. The music pounded in his ears, drowning out all thought, all reason. It was no longer a simple tune. It had become something darker, something ancient and malevolent that fed on his life force, aging him with every spin of the carousel. He could feel his strength waning, his youth slipping away, replaced by the frailty of old age. His vision blurred, his hands trembling as the years seemed to rush past him, each spin of the carousel stealing more of his vitality. "Ride with us," the carousel seemed to whisper, the voices of the horses mingling with the music. "Join us in our endless dance." George shook his head. The pull was too strong, the carousel's grip on him unbreakable. He could feel himself weakening, his will eroding with each passing moment, until all that remained was the haunting melody, the relentless spin of the carousel, and the realization that there was no escape. Carnival had them all now, each of them ensnared in their own personal hell, traps closing in, suffocating them in their fear and despair. The fog that clung to the air thickened, becoming a physical presence, a barrier that separated them from the outside world, trapping them in this twisted realm where reality had been distorted beyond recognition. Martha was lost in a loop of grief, the fortune teller's voice a constant reminder of her failures, her regrets, until she could no longer distinguish between memory and nightmare. Tommy wandered through endless corridors, his mind unraveling as the house twisted and shifted around him, turning his deepest fears into reality. Evelyn was surrounded by her own malevolent reflections, each one a twisted version of herself, taunting her, mocking her, until she could no longer tell where she ended and they began. And George was trapped in the carousel's grip, the music feeding on his life force, draining him of his youth, his strength, until he was nothing but a hollow shell. The carnival thrived on their fear, their despair, growing stronger as they grew weaker, feeding on their darkest emotions until there was nothing left but the realization that they were trapped with no way out, no escape from the nightmares that had ensnared them. The carnival had claimed them, body and soul, and it would not let them go. Chapter 4, Uncovering the Truth. The carnival, which had initially seemed an inexplicable anomaly, began to reveal its true nature in the small moments of clarity that each character fought to retain. It was no mere illusion, but a living entity, born of malevolence and sustained by the very souls it ensnared. As Martha, Tommy, Evelyn, and George stood against the oppressive force that threatened to consume them, fragments of the carnival's sinister history started to surface, like shards of a shattered mirror reflecting the dark truth. Martha's hands, still trembling from the relentless assault of her own memories, fumbled through the crumbling pages of an old journal she had found in a dusty corner, Madame Zara's tent. The leather cover was worn, the pages yellowed with age, but the words inside were sharp, as if they had been penned yesterday. The journal belonged to a man named Ambrose Vane, a name that sent a shiver down her spine. She read with growing horror as Vane described his descent into darkness, his obsession with power and control, and his ultimate decision to bind himself to forces beyond comprehension. Ambrose Vane had once been the ringmaster of a small traveling show, carnival that wandered from town to town, bringing delight and wonder to all who visited. But as the years passed, crowds dwindled, and Vane's ambition grew. He could not bear to see his life's work fade into obscurity, become just another forgotten relic of the past. In his desperation, he sought out forbidden knowledge, ancient rites whispered about in secret circles, and made a pact that would change the course of his carnival forever. The journal detailed the horrific ritual, the dark bargain struck with entities that existed in the spaces between life and death, in the shadows that flickered just out of sight. In exchange for eternal success, Vane's carnival would become a vessel, trap that ensnared the souls of those who entered, feeding on their fear, their sorrow, and their despair. Carnival would thrive, but at a terrible cost, the cost of countless lives, condemned to an eternity of torment. Tommy, lost within the ever-shifting corridors of the haunted house, stumbled upon an old photograph pinned to a wall that had not been there moments before. The image was black and white, grainy with age, but he could make out the figures clearly. Children, their faces alight with excitement, standing before a grand entrance, bore the same twisted insignia as the carnival he was now trapped in. But there was something off about their expressions, something that made his skin crawl. Their eyes were wide, almost too wide, and their smiles stretched unnaturally across their faces, as if they were being pulled by invisible strings. As he gazed at the photograph, faces began to change, the smiles warping into expressions of terror, the eyes hollowing out into empty sockets. The carnival had taken them, just as it had taken him, trapping them in a never-ending nightmare. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. This was no ordinary haunted house, no mere illusion. It was a manifestation of the fear that had been planted in those children so many years ago, fear that had festered and grown, feeding the carnival's insatiable hunger. Evelyn, her mind still reeling from the encounter with her malevolent reflections, found herself standing before a series of grotesque paintings that lined the walls of the Hall of Mirrors. Each one depicted scenes of suffering, of torment and despair, painted with such vividness that they seemed almost alive. The brushstrokes were chaotic, violent, as if the artist had been driven mad by the images they were compelled to create. One painting in particular caught her eye, an image of a man, his face twisted in agony, surrounded by flames that seemed to reach out from the canvas. She realized with a jolt that she had seen this man before, in the reflections that tormented her. It was Ambrose Vane, the ringmaster, the man who had condemned so many to an eternity of suffering. The paintings told the story of his descent into madness, his transformation from a man driven by ambition to a monster fueled by the darkest forces. And as Evelyn stared into the depths of the flames, she felt a connection, a thread that linked her to the man in the painting, to the carnival that had ensnared them all. George, now barely able to stand, stumbled from the carousel, his once strong legs weak and trembling. The music still echoed in his ears, a twisted lullaby that threatened to pull him back into its grasp. But as he fell to his knees, his hands clawing at the dirt beneath him, he felt something solid, something buried just beneath the surface. With what little strength he had left, he dug, pulling at the earth until his fingers closed around a small, weathered box. Inside, he found letters, brittle with age, but still legible. They were from the townspeople, letters of desperation and grief, sent to the ringmaster in the years after the carnival had passed through their town. Each letter spoke of loss, of children who had gone missing, of loved ones who had been consumed by madness. The townsfolk had pleaded with Vane, begging him to return what he had taken. The letters had gone unanswered. The ringmaster had moved on, leaving only despair in his wake. The carnival's hunger sated for the time being. As George read through the letters, the truth became clear. The carnival had not chosen this town at random. It had been drawn here, pulled by the weight of the town's collective sorrow, by the secrets and tragedies that had festered in the dark corners of the townspeople's hearts. The carnival fed on that darkness, using it to fuel its malevolent energy, to manifest once again and claim new victims. But within that truth, there was also a glimmer of hope, faint light in the overwhelming darkness. The carnival thrived on fear, guilt, on sorrow, but it was not invincible. The characters began to realize that the only way to break free from the carnival's grip was to confront the very emotions that had drawn it to them in the first place. They would have to face their own demons, the guilt, grief, and the fear that had been buried within them for so long. Martha, clutching the journal to her chest, knew that she would have to confront the loss of her daughter, to let go of the guilt that had consumed her for so many years. Tommy, still clutching the photograph, understood that he would have to face the fear that had haunted him since childhood. Fear that had made him feel so small, so powerless. Evelyn, standing before the burning image of Ambrose Vane, realized that she would have to confront the dark parts of herself. The insecurities, the doubts that had been reflected back at her in the Hall of Mirrors. And George, holding the letters in his trembling hands, knew that he would have to find the strength to forgive himself, to let go of the regrets that had aged him long before the carousel had done its damage. The path ahead was uncertain, and the carnival would not release them easily. It would fight to keep them, draw them deeper into its twisted web. But for the first time since their nightmare had begun, there was a glimmer of hope, chance that they might escape the carnival's grasp. They would have to confront the darkness within, face the truth of their own lives, and in doing so, they might just find a way to break the cycle of torment and free themselves from the carnival's sinister hold. Chapter 5: The Final Showdown. The carnival, once a place of twisted wonder and nightmarish allure, had become a battleground where the very souls of those trapped within its confines fought for their freedom. The fog that had once obscured their vision now lifted slightly, revealing the decaying, rotten core of the place, festering wound in the landscape that pulsed with the sinister life force of the carnival. Martha, Tommy, Evelyn, and George stood at the center of this grotesque labyrinth, knowing that their final test was upon them. The air around them seemed to hum with anticipation, as if the carnival itself was eager to witness their struggle. Martha, face set in grim determination, took a deep breath as she prepared to confront the specter that had haunted her for so long. Fortune teller's tent loomed before her, the entrance flapping gently in the wind, beckoning her to enter once more. But Martha knew this time would be different. She stepped forward, her hand clutching the locket that held the picture of her daughter, a talisman of the love she had lost but would never allow to define her. Inside the tent, the air was thick with the smell of incense and decay, the haze swirling around her like a living thing. In the center of the room stood the fortune teller, her eyes gleaming with malevolent intent. But beside her, a figure materialized from the shadows, a man, tall and gaunt, his face a mask of sorrow and pain. It was her husband, the man whose death had plunged her into a well of grief so deep she had nearly drowned in it. He reached out to her, his eyes pleading, his voice a whisper that seemed to come from the very walls. "Martha, come with me. We can be together again." But Martha did not move. She stood her ground, her heart aching with the memories of the life they had shared, the love that had once been her anchor. "No," she said softly, her voice trembling but resolute. "I loved you, but you're gone, and I have to let you go." As she spoke the words, the figure of her husband began to waver, his form flickering like a candle flame in a gust of wind. The fortune teller hissed in anger, her hands moving in frantic gestures as she tried to regain control. But Martha's resolve was stronger. She closed her eyes, focusing on the warmth of the locket in her hand, the memory of her daughter's smile, and the knowledge that she still had something to live for. When she opened her eyes, the tent was empty. The fortune teller and the spirit of her husband were gone, her power over her shattered by her acceptance of the past and the release of her grief. Martha took a deep breath, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders as she stepped out of the tent, free at last from the chains of her sorrow. Meanwhile, Tommy found himself once again facing the haunted house, a decrepit facade looming over him like a predator ready to strike. The door creaked open, and he stepped inside, the darkness swallowing him whole. The walls closed in around him, the air thick with the stench of rot and fear. But Tommy knew that this time he could not run. The creatures that had tormented him before would return, but he would be ready for them. As he moved deeper into the house, the shadows began to shift, forming grotesque shapes that slithered along the walls, their eyes glowing with malevolence. They whispered his name, their voices a chorus of nightmares, haunting him, mocking his fear. But Tommy did not flinch. He knew now that these horrors were born from his own mind, manifestations of the terror that had held him captive for so long. Creatures lunged at him, their claws reaching for his flesh, but Tommy stood his ground. He clenched his fists, his breath steady, his mind focused on the truth that had eluded him for so long. These were not real. They were shadows, illusions, the remnants of his childhood fears. And he was no longer a child. With a roar of defiance, Tommy lashed out, not with his fists, but with his will. The creatures recoiled, their forms twisting and writhing as they tried to maintain their grip on him. But it was no use. The house began to shake, the walls cracking, the ceiling crumbling. The monsters dissolved into smoke, their power broken by the strength of his resolve. Tommy staggered out of the house, his heart pounding, but his fear conquered. Evelyn, standing before the endless expanse of mirrors, felt her breath catch in her throat as her reflections stared back at her, each one a twisted caricature of the person she feared she had become. They sneered at her, their eyes filled with contempt, their mouths twisted into cruel smiles. Each reflection whispered words of doubt, echoing the insecurities that had plagued her for so long. But Evelyn had had enough. She would no longer be a prisoner to the image of herself that these mirrors reflected. She took a step forward, then another, until she stood directly in front of the nearest mirror. Her reflection leered at her, but Evelyn met its gaze with unwavering determination. She raised her hand and, with a fierce cry, struck the glass with all her strength. The mirror shattered, shards of glass raining down around her like a storm of crystal tears. But Evelyn did not stop. She moved from mirror to mirror, each one splintering under the force of her blows, each one breaking the hold that her insecurities had over her. As the last mirror fell to the ground in pieces, Evelyn stood amidst the wreckage, breathing heavily, feeling a sense of liberation she had never known before. And then there was George. His body weakened, his mind fogged by the relentless pull of the carousel. The music still echoed in his ears, a haunting melody that seemed to be the soundtrack of his own demise. But as he stumbled away from the cursed ride, he knew that he could not let it claim him. The carousel thrived on his fear of death, on the dread that had gripped him ever since he was a boy, watching his father fade away before his eyes. George closed his eyes, focusing on the inevitability that he had always feared. Death was a part of life, an ending that every person would face no matter how they tried to escape it. It was not something to be feared, but something to be accepted, a truth as old as time itself. And in that acceptance, George found strength. He turned back to the carousel, the lights flickering ominously, the painted horses frozen in grotesque poses. The ride still called to him, but its power was waning. George stood tall, no longer afraid, no longer bound by the fear that had once controlled him. The carousel creaked and groaned, its mechanisms straining as it tried to draw him back. But George walked away, each step breaking the chains that had held him for so long. As the four of them gathered in the center of the carnival, each having faced their own demons and emerged victorious, a low, mocking laugh echoed through the air. The fog thickened, swirling around them like a living thing. And from its depths emerged a figure, tall and imposing, his presence commanding the very ground they stood on. The ringmaster, his face a mask of cruel amusement, stepped forward, his eyes glinting with dark intent. "You think you've won," he sneered, his voice dripping with malice. "Escaping my little games was only the beginning. The carnival is alive, and I am its heart. To destroy me, you must destroy the very essence of this place, but I assure you, I will not go quietly." With a flourish of his hand, the carnival around them began to shift, the ground trembling as the attractions came to life once more, twisted versions of the horrors they had just escaped. The fortune-teller's tent grew tendrils of darkness, reaching out to ensnare them. The haunted house groaned as its walls stretched and distorted, creatures within clawing their way out. The mirrors reformed, the shattered glass reassembling into new, more terrifying reflections. And the carousel began to spin faster, music reaching a fever pitch, its horses breaking free from their posts to circle around the ringmaster like loyal guardians. Martha, Tommy, Evelyn, and George stood together, their hearts pounding but their resolve unshaken. They knew now what they had to do. The ringmaster was the key, heart of the carnival, and if they could destroy him, the nightmare would end. But the task before them was daunting, and the carnival would not give up its prey without a fight. With a shout, Tommy charged forward, the courage he had found in the haunted house propelling him toward the ringmaster. But as he drew near, the ground beneath him cracked open, a chasm of darkness yawning at his feet. He stumbled, nearly falling, but Martha was there, grabbing his arm and pulling him back. "We have to do this together," she said, her voice steady despite the terror that gripped her. "We're stronger as one." Evelyn nodded, stepping forward with determination in her eyes. "He's feeding off our fears. We can't let him control us anymore." George, his face set in grim resolve, joined them, the letters from the box still clutched in his hand. "We end this now." The ringmaster laughed again, but there was a hint of uncertainty in his eyes. The carnival around him seemed to flicker, as if it was losing strength. The four of them began to circle him, their hands joined, their combined strength a beacon of light in the encroaching darkness. The ringmaster snarled, lashing out with a whip that seemed to be made of pure shadow, but it snapped back as it touched the circle they had formed. The power of their unity too strong for him to break. The ground beneath them rumbled, the attractions twisting and warping, trying to crush them, but they held firm. Together, they closed their eyes, focusing on the light within them, the strength they had found in facing their fears. The ringmaster screamed, his voice a high-pitched wail that echoed through the carnival, but it was drowned out by the power of their collective will. The light grew brighter, piercing the fog, cutting through the shadows, and the ringmaster began to dissolve, his form breaking apart like ash in the wind. With a final, agonized scream, he vanished. and the carnival around them collapsed, the attractions crumbling into dust, the fog lifting to reveal the night sky above. The ground beneath their feet was solid once more, the night air cool and fresh, free of the stench of decay and fear. Chapter 6. The Twist and the Escape. The confrontation with the ringmaster began like a slow, creeping dread, tightening around them like a noose. The fog, thick and oppressive, swirled around their ankles, threatening to pull them back into the nightmarish carnival. But Martha, Tommy, Evelyn, and George stood firm, their resolve hardening into something unbreakable. They had come too far, seen too much to falter now. The ringmaster loomed before them, his smile a grotesque parody of joy, the eyes black pits that reflected nothing but malice. "You've been quite the spectacle," he hissed, his voice slithering around them like a serpent. "But all shows must come to an end." It was then that the unease they had felt around George began to crystallize into something darker, something more sinister. The sheriff had been the one to guide them, to lead them to this confrontation. But now, in the face of the ringmaster's taunts, his hand began to tremble. A memory flickered in his mind, a distant echo that grew louder with each passing second. Martha, always perceptive, caught the change in George's demeanor. She stepped closer to him, her eyes narrowing as she tried to understand what was happening. "George," she whispered, "what's wrong?" His gaze shifted to hers, and for a moment there was a flicker of something that looked like fear. But it was not fear of the ringmaster. It was something deeper, something rooted in the core of his being. "I don't know," George murmured, his voice thick with confusion. "I feel like I've been here before." The ringmaster's laughter shattered the moment, a harsh grating sound that made their skin crawl. "Of course you have," he said, his tone dripping with venomous glee. "Blood calls to blood, after all." The truth struck them like a thunderbolt, a revelation so shocking it left them reeling. George was not just a pawn in the ringmaster's twisted game. He was a part of it, bound to the carnival by ties he had never known existed. He was the ringmaster's descendant, the last link in a chain of darkness that stretched back through generations. "No," George whispered, shaking his head as if trying to dislodge the truth. "No, that can't be." But deep down, he knew it was true. He had always been drawn to the carnival, even as a child, long before it had returned. There had been whispers in the town, old stories about a cursed bloodline, but he had never believed them, never thought they could apply to him. Now, standing before the ringmaster, the truth was undeniable. The others recoiled in shock, their trust in George shattering as the reality of his lineage became clear. "You're one of them," Tommy said, his voice thick with betrayal. "All this time, you were leading us right into his trap." George shook his head violently, panic flooding his senses. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." But the ringmaster only grinned wider, his teeth gleaming like sharpened knives. "Ignorance is no excuse, Sheriff. You've played your part well, and now the final act begins." As the fog thickened, curling around them like the fingers of the dead, Ringmaster extended his hand toward George. "Join me, embrace your legacy, and together we can rebuild the carnival stronger than ever. Town will be ours, the people our playthings, forever bound to the darkness we create." George's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of his choices crushing him. He could feel the darkness within him, pull of the bloodline he had never known, hugging him toward the ringmaster. But as he looked at his friends, at Martha, Evelyn, and Tommy, who had trusted him, who had fought beside him, he knew he could not give in, could not let the darkness claim him, no matter what it meant for his own soul. "I won't let you win," George said, his voice trembling but resolute. "I'll stop you, even if it means." The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. There was only one way to break the cycle, to end the ringmaster's reign once and for all. He had to destroy the carnival from within, using the very connection that bound him to it. But it would cost him everything: his life, his soul, very existence. A calmness settled over him as the decision was made. He looked at his friends one last time, his gaze lingering on each of them, committing their faces to memory. "Get out of here," he said quietly. "I'll hold him off." Martha, always the leader, opened her mouth to protest. George shook his head. "There's no time. Go." Urgency in his voice spurred them into action. With one last desperate look at George, they turned and fled. their footsteps echoing in the empty night. As they ran, the fog parted for them, as if understanding that their time in the carnival was over. George turned back to the ringmaster, who was watching him with a mixture of amusement and curiosity. "Gonna sacrifice yourself?" Ringmaster sneered. How noble, how utterly futile. George was no longer afraid. "Maybe," he said, his voice steady, "but I'll take you down with me." With a roar, George lunged at the ringmaster, the connection between them flaring to life like a spark catching dry tinder. Ground beneath them shook, the very air around them crackling with dark energy. George could feel the carnival's power pulsing through him, trying to consume him, but he held on, drawing the darkness into himself. The ringmaster's grin faltered as he realized what was happening. "No!" he screamed, his voice rising to a frenzied pitch. "You can't." Yet, as they began to walk back to their homes, something lingered in the back of their minds, a nagging unease that refused to be silenced. The carnival was gone. The secrets of the town remained, buried beneath the surface, waiting for the day they would rise again. As they passed the spot where the carnival had once stood, Martha paused, her brow furrowing. She could have sworn she heard something. Faint, haunting melody carried on the wind. But when she turned to look, there was nothing there. Shaking off the feeling, she continued on, but the unease clung to her like a shadow. The darkness had been defeated, but it had left its mark, a stain that could never be washed away. And somewhere, in the deepest corners of the night, darkness waited, biding its time, ready to return when the town's secrets were once again forgotten. The survivors knew that one day they would have to face it again. For now, they would live, carrying the scars of their ordeal and the knowledge that the past could never truly be buried. And as they disappeared into the night, faint light flickered where the carnival had stood, a reminder that the darkness was never far away, always watching, always waiting. The end of one nightmare perhaps, but the beginning of another. But it was too late. George closed his eyes, focusing on the connection, on the blood that tied him to the carnival. He could feel the power building, growing beyond his control, but he didn't let go. He held on with every ounce of strength he had left, pulling the darkness into himself until it overwhelmed him, until he was nothing but a vessel for the power of the carnival. And then, with a final, shattering scream, George let the power explode outward, a shockwave of dark energy that ripped through the carnival, tearing it apart piece by piece. The attractions crumbled to dust, the fog dissipated, and the ground beneath them cracked and split open, swallowing the remnants of the carnival whole. As the power surged through him, George felt his body disintegrating, his very essence being consumed by the darkness. But there was no pain, only a deep, profound sense of peace. He had done it. He had broken the cycle. The carnival was gone, the ringmaster defeated, and the town was free. In the distance, he heard the screams of the ringmaster, final, desperate wail that echoed through the night, and then was silent. When Martha, Tommy, and Evelyn finally stopped running, they found themselves on the edge of town, carnival nowhere in sight. The air was clear, the night still, as if nothing had ever happened. But the scars on their hearts told a different story. They stood there, catching their breath, trying to process everything that had just occurred. "Do you think he's gone?" Tommy asked, voice shaky. Martha, still catching her breath, nodded. "Did it?" George stopped him. Evelyn, her eyes filled with tears, looked back in the direction of the carnival. But at what cost? The town, once peaceful and unremarkable, was now marked by the darkness it had tried to bury. The survivors knew they would never be the same. The memories of the carnival forever etched into their minds. But as they looked out over the quiet streets, they knew they had faced the darkness and survived.